Hey everybody, back at you again with another sprite chart today and another review video. So again, this review is going to center around a sprite chart. This time, instead of being on the Renaissance, it's going to be on the age of the Reformation and the wars of religion. And we mentioned these a little bit in the last video because they're happening, they overlap, right? So that, we typically bullseye the Renaissance era from like 1440 to like 1550 or 1600 or something like that. The Reformation we peg at 1517, and goes until 1648 in this case, and so they do overlap quite a bit. Many people, say things like Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. That basically the events of the Renaissance, the Northern Humanistic Renaissance, are what lead to the Reformation. And in many cases they're right, and in many cases they're wrong. Um, but just so you know, we do have some timeline overlap between the Reformation and the Renaissance. So let's get down to it. So again, we're using a sprite format. This is, again, a great way to compare different time periods. You can see I've changed the side over here. The dates are over here as well. Feel free to pause this and start your chart. Remember, please don't write down all of the letters. Just probably start with S and maybe the heading of Reformation and Wars of Religion, 1517 to 1648, because you don't know how big the boxes are going to be. And I will just go ahead and tell you right now that the political box is extra super big today, and so is the religion box, depending on how much you want to put in there. Let's see. Again, this is fantastic fodder for contextualization on the DBQ. This is one of those sheets of paper that should be up on your wall or on the desk in front of you or in your notebook when you go to take your exam on the 13th of May. I think yesterday. Oh, there it says it right there. So I'm just going to go ahead and change that from May 12 to May 13, and then we'll go ahead and get started again. Let's see here. I would encourage you to write these down, write down on your notebook, and make it so that you can compare the different categories. All right, so let's get rocking. Again, we're going to start with S, not because it's the most important, but because it comes first when you spell the word sprite. So as far as the social aspect of the Reformation and Wars of Religion, you're going to see a lot of overlap between this and the Renaissance. Again, with the whole social hierarchy thing, we've still got the clergy, the monarchs, the nobles. We're still running with that ancient regime or ancien regime if you're French, and we're still running with those three estates. We still see the urban artisans not fitting the mold. And we talked about that last time. So let's get a little bit more specific on the effect of the Reformation on society when we talk about women. So women's position improves slightly, though as you know, the Protestant Reformation is not wholesale. There are parts of Europe that remain Catholic and parts that reform or just turn to Protestantism. And that within the Protestant idea, within the Protestant umbrella, you've got Lutheranism, you've got Reform or Calvinism, you've got Anabaptism, you've got Anglicanism, and each of those is going to see women in a unique light. And so, let's see, Protestants praise women for their roles as mothers and housewives. There's much more equality in marriage. I wouldn't call it much more, but it is a little bit easier for women to divorce. Protestant women are given a position of pastor's wife, and so sort of doesn't quite bring them on level with pastors and priests, but I would say that they're slightly below. Both Calvin and Luther are incredibly devoted to and complimentary of their wives. Women are educated. Women are encouraged to learn how to read in Protestant faiths. We know, that by and large, the Protestant faith pushes literacy and pushes education. And that's no different for women. They're included because they're encouraged to read the Bible for themselves, just like men are. one drawback, we see women lose convents as places of power. And so here, remember, these convents, these are where nuns live. Um, Nuns are basically female versions of monks. Nuns, and so convents are these places set apart from the rest of society. It's a primarily female community, though it is run typically by a priest or a man. He's not always there. And so these women in the convents are sort of a place of power because it's only women, and so women within these convents are able to exercise their power. Now, not all convents are the same. Not all convents are encouraging of women to speak their minds. It really depends on the Mother Superior who's there. But just the simple loss of these female-only communities can be seen as detracting from women's rights during this time period. So marriage age during this time period increases. Couples are having a harder time supporting themselves. By and large, at least in Western Europe, families or men and women are encouraged to be able to support themselves, and to then, when they marry, to move out and set up their own households. And so they have to save and save and save and save and save for that. Family size is typically 5 to 6. That's because you've got a mom, a dad, that's 2, and then they would have 2 to 4 kids. Roughly 50% of those would survive to adulthood. You've also got large numbers of households with a single man with kids because childbirth is incredibly dangerous, as we've discussed many times. Wet nursing, this is the time period when wet nursing is super popular among the upper class. This is where you hire someone else to breastfeed your child. This is also the period of witch hunts and the period of the German Peasants' Revolt. And witch hunts, again, target women. This is definitely seen as a negative impact on women's rights. And we see this both in Catholic and Protestant areas. And then the German Peasant Revolt is this push where Luther says that all people, rich, poor, men, women, have spiritual equality. And remember, the German peasants decide that they're going to push for social equality as well. And if you don't remember, Luther sort of hems and haws and wishes and washes, eventually coming out against the German Peasants' Revolt and encourages the princes to squish the German Peasant Rebellion, which they do incredibly brutally. And so that's the highlights of the social aspect. Let's move on to political. Now you'll notice that it says political 1. That's because the text just got way too small to put it all on one screen. So this is just the first part of the political box. So first of all, let's talk about this idea that religion is used as a method of standing up to authority. Religion is leveraged by those in charge as a way to encourage people to toe the line. And so if you want to stand up against the people who are in charge of you, then a good way to do that would be to convert. And so that's why we see a lot of German princes becoming Protestant, not necessarily because they believe in Protestantism, but because they want to stand up to the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, I cannot say that some of them didn't legitimately believe in Lutheranism, but it is very convenient, shall we say, that becoming Protestant means that it puts a division between you and the emperor and gives you a reason to stand up to the emperor on religious grounds. We see the same thing with French Huguenots. The nobility in France are the percentage of Protestant nobility far outweighs the general proportion of Protestants in France. It's something like the general population is like 5% ends up being Protestant, whereas within the nobility it's more like 20%. And again, this just becomes a way for them to stand up to the French king, who is Catholic. And even when a Protestant, Henry of Navarre, becomes the king, he converts to Catholicism before his coronation. And then the idea that Protestant kings and the Pope, a good reason to convert to Protestantism, and you can see this in like England, is that and I know that Henry VIII wants a son, but it's very convenient that when Henry VIII cuts ties with the Pope, he no longer sends tithe money to Rome to the Pope. That chunk of change that routinely went to Italy now stays in England. It also allows kings to confiscate monastic lands. So any convents, like we talked about in the last slide, any monk monasteries could have also been confiscated. And Henry VIII takes a huge chunk of these lands and then sells them. He can either hold on to them as a power base, or he can sell them as a power base. Either way, he's got a good chunk of change coming into him, and a way for him to gain political support by doing that. We see the many wars of Charles V during this time period as the Ottoman Empire moves slowly north. And so this is another huge political event that occurs during this time period, the wars of Charles V, both against the Ottomans and against the Valois family, which are the French. So Charles V, who's the king, remember, of not just Austria, where he fights the Ottoman Empire, but also the king of Spain, where he fights the French. And so there's a huge amount of conflict during this time period, headed up by Charles V, which, of course, is one of the reasons why Luther doesn't get set on fire, right? So Luther is able to live and continue his message far longer than some of the previous reformers who had come through the area, because Charles V is continuously distracted by the Habsburg-Valois wars and the wars against the Turks. And so, here's a political reason why the Reformation of Luther is allowed to continue. All right, so let's get into more particular areas. Let's get into the French wars of religion. The French, remember, have a series of civil wars between Catholics and Protestants. We've got the Guises, who are Catholic. We've got the Valois, which is the royal family, which is dying out, headed up by Catherine de' Medici. And we've got the Bourbons, who are the Protestants from the south of France, who will eventually rise to take the throne and defeat the Guises. That's why they get a W and the Guises get an L. And this ends with the conversion and ascension of Henry IV to the throne. It's Henry of Navarre. Remember, he's the one who was Protestant. He was Reformed or Calvinist, and then he decides that Paris is worth a mass. And he is one of that group of politiques that quite famously puts politics over religion, and ushers in at least a period of at least relative peace. It's not very peaceful, but it's relatively peaceful compared to what it was before. And he's the one that issues that Edict of Nantes, saying that Huguenots can worship freely in certain French towns with walls, and basically trying to bring an end to this period of incredible instability in France. Of course, I can't say that it brings instability and brings in peace, because Henry IV himself is assassinated by radical Catholics. Not complete peace. Let's move on to the next one, the revolt in the Spanish Netherlands. So the Spanish Netherlands, we call it the Dutch Republic. Sometimes these days we call it just the Netherlands, along with a piece of Belgium at the time, the southern Catholic counties. But after years of war, the Netherlands, it does eventually split into the Dutch Republic and the Spanish Netherlands in the Catholic South. And the Spanish Netherlands is going to switch hands time and time again. Today it's called Belgium. During the French Revolution, it's going to be the Austrian Netherlands, and that's where Louis and Marie are going to make their mad dash to freedom, the flight to Varennes, which fits. But this revolt in the Spanish Netherlands is on one hand commercial, but on another hand religious, and so it is both political and religious and economic. And so, well, I'll probably end up talking about it again. So let's see here, Spain versus England. This is a classic, both again religion and politics. We've got Elizabeth I, another politique up in England. Remember, Protestant, head of the. She comes down with the Elizabethan settlement, head of the English Anglican Church. started by her father, Henry VIII. She authorizes pirates to attack Spanish treasure ships, which are basically like floating cash pinatas full of gold and silver. And so she authorizes these attacks in the Americas. Spain, even though she denies everything, Spain is like, we're not doing this. They're also upset for a variety of other reasons. Remember that Philip II, who is the King of Spain, follow the soap opera if you would. Philip II is married to Mary the First, Elizabeth's Catholic sister, half-sister, who was the Queen of England, and then remember died. Philip then proposes marriage to Elizabeth. She says no because she doesn't want England to come under Catholic Spanish rule. Philip's a little upset about that. He's a little upset about these treasure ships. He's a little upset about them being Protestant. Philip is intensely Catholic. And so Spain sends the Armada, which is eventually defeated and helps to mark the end of Spanish hegemony within Europe, and sort of marks the beginning of the rise of England as well. And then, of course, the big event toward the end of all this, from 1618 to 1648, is the 30 Years' War. And I know it has, remember, 4 phases. The first 2 are primarily religious phases, so they'll be in the next screen. But this phase 3 and phase 4, phase 3, remember, is a blend of both religious and political, as the Lutheran Gustavus Adolphus is backed by the French against the Catholic. The Lutheran Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden is backed in part financially by the Catholic French against the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor. And then as we move into, and then once Gustavus Adolphus dies and the Swedes sort of fade, remember that phase 4, this international phase, France openly declares war against the Holy Roman Empire. And so we've got Catholic against Catholic. And so loses all pretense of a religious conflict at that point. And eventually the political ramifications of this is that the Austrians, the Austrian Habsburgs, lose the 30 Years' War, and the emperor decides to turn away from trying to control the German states to his north and west, and instead begins to focus more toward the south and east, toward Hungary, toward the Balkan peninsulas. Eventually going to be the territory where Gavrilo Princip assassinates the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and sparks World War I. So the Austrians reorient themselves there. All right, so religious. So there are 2 screens for religious. I put basically that we have notes on this, on Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, the Anabaptist, and the Anglican Church. And so we have huge changes, as well as the Catholic Counter-Reformation, which probably should have been on the screen as well. And so somewhere we have a graphic organizer. I know this isn't that graphic organizer. This is the one from the last video, but I couldn't find that other one. So I just decided to put up an example instead. But on a larger scale, excuse me, coughing into my elbow. On a larger scale, we have incredible change in the religions of the time. You've obviously got Luther in 1517. You've got Calvin and his Reformed Church. You've got Zwingli, who starts a church in Sweden but is eventually killed in battle, and his church sort of blends into Calvinism. You've got the Anabaptists, who are sort of everywhere and also sort of hated by everyone. You've got the Anglican Church up in England, which is not even formed for religious reform reasons. It's formed for political reform reasons. And then you've got the Catholic Counter-Reformation, where the Catholics decide, maybe we should reform. Let's call the Council of Trent. You know what? We're not going to reform. Everything we said was right, and you're wrong. And then you've got the Jesuits, who come through as these almost like frontline shock troops in a religious war. They become missionaries to the New World, missionaries to Asia. You see evidence of the Jesuits out in China. And of course, into Protestant areas, the Jesuits are let loose in the first phase of the 30 Years' War, that Bohemian phase, where the Holy Roman Emperor decides he's going to re-Catholicize Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic, and very famously, the Czech Republic is still Catholic today, due to the efforts of this phase 1 of the 30 Years' War. You end up with the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, saying that Lutheranism and Catholicism are both legal in the Holy Roman Empire. This is like the final act of Charles V before he abdicates both to his brother and gives the Austrian kingdoms to his brother, and the Spanish kingdoms and the American territories to his son. And then he goes off to a monastery. And then, of course, like as I mentioned before, the 30 Years' War comes about 60 years after that. And so in phase 1 and phase 2, these are primarily religious conflicts where you've got a civil war within the Holy Roman Empire. In the Bohemian phase, you've got the Lutheran Danes fighting the Lutheran North Germans fighting the Catholic Holy Roman Empire. And then, of course, we move into phase 3 and 4, which are more political. But all that ends with the Peace of Westphalia, which is a huge peace treaty. We're not going to get a whole lot into that. But religiously speaking, it says that Lutheranism, Calvinism, and Catholicism are now legal in the Holy Roman Empire. And so Calvinism gets its legal recognition in the Peace of Westphalia. Also, remember, the Pope doesn't like the Peace of Westphalia. He doesn't want Lutheranism and Calvinism to be legitimized. And everybody just says, that's great. Thanks for stopping by. We're going to do this anyway. And so the Pope is on his way out, as far as political influence goes, which is why this ends up being the end of the first era of the class, 1648, because of the Peace of Westphalia and the changes that it brings. All right. Now, those were the 3 big ones. Let's get into the intellectual, technological, and economic aspects. Intellectually speaking, we're still very much in the Renaissance. We're still looking at humanism, we're still looking at secularism and the here and now. We're still questioning why. We're questioning, why do we do what we do? I mean, Luther is the ultimate question. 95 theses about why the church needs to change. He's sitting there writing out 95 reasons and questioning why the church does what it does. Eventually settling on things like sola fide, sola scriptura, and the priesthood of all believers. The sola fide in itself says, by faith alone, you gain salvation. You don't have to do good works to gain salvation. And so he is sitting there questioning the traditions of the Catholic Church that have been around for 1,517 years or so, give or take. Let's just go with 1,500. It's a nice round number. Literacy is increasing. More and more people are reading because Protestants emphasize reading the Bible for yourself. Eventually, the Catholics begin to encourage literacy because they find that they're getting outsmarted on the streets and in arguments and in great debates by Protestants who have read the Bible. And so the Catholic Church encourages its priests to become literate and to read the church's version of the Bible and the church's interpretations of that Bible. Also during this period, we get the Baroque, which, remember, this is the time period of the great big cupola within St. Peter's, just the massive, and the glitz and the glamour and the shininess, and the Hall of Mirrors, Versailles, all done not just to create art, but to create awe, to put people in awe of first the Catholic Reformation, but also the absolute monarchs who are going to come sort of at the end of this period, as the Baroque crosses periods from across 1648 into the next period. And you get music. Baroque music would include guys like Bach and a lot of church choral music. And in the scientific revolution, which is continuing to go along in the background, this is Kepler. This is when Kepler uses math to prove heliocentrism and elliptical planetary orbits. And so he is right in the beginning of the 1600s with that. And so we've got some overlap there with the scientific revolution. Technologically speaking, we're still rocking the printing press. It is still that important. It is absolutely essential to Luther and his Reformation that people be able to read. And it's because of the increased literacy rates that the pamphlets that Luther puts out are read out loud to the illiterate. and his ideas are continued. And then the last, the next one down here, Galileo and his telescope, right? Galileo uses a telescope to view Jupiter's moons. He creates this telescope, the creation of new scientific instruments, the thermometer, the telescope, the microscope. These are all being invented during the barometer. These are all being invented during this time period to improve our knowledge of the physical world. And so you cannot, Galileo sits here as sort of representative of all of those ideas. And then finally, economics. We mentioned earlier that Protestant kings no longer pay taxes to Rome. We mentioned that this is at least in the last video, this is the time when Spain is ascendant. Spain is making money hand over fist from the Americas, but they're also throwing it out and paying it out to artisans and shipbuilders and weapons manufacturers, and they're just spending it about as fast as they can get it. And as they spend it, they actually devalue much of the currency of Europe. All of this silver floods the market, and everybody's got silver. And as you know, if everybody's got something, then it's worth less. And so silver becomes, this leads to massive inflation. Silver becomes worth less than it was before. And in spite of the fact that Spain is making gobs and gobs and gobs and gobs and gobs of money, the amount of money they have actually begins to decrease, and they actually can't pay their debts anymore. And Spain declares bankruptcy multiple times. I think it's like 4 times. Philip II declares bankruptcy. Eventually, he ruins the banking family that had often backed him, the Fuggers, and they actually go under as a result of backing Spain and Spain not being able to pay their debts. And so we're still in the era of exploration. We're still pushing for, we're still getting money out of the Americas. We're still pushing and trading with Asia. This is the era of the Dutch. The 1600s become the century of the Dutch, which we'll talk about in the next video. So I think that wraps up this one. All right, so if you have any questions, let me know. Hit me up on Remind, message me through Classroom, send me an email, whatever you need. I hope this helps. Again, as you finish this up, as you wrap this up, please hang on to these SPRITE charts. Make sure that you have them on exam day on May 13th so that you can use them for that contextualization piece in your DBQ. All right, got any questions, let me know, and I'll have a couple more of these coming up in the coming days. I'll see you guys then. Bye.